$45,000. That was the number attached to Ryan Cole's name. $200 was attached to mine. The contrast didn't arrive with drama, no build-up, no warning, just two numbers. Delivered calmly, as if they belonged on the same scale. They didn't. One could pay off a car. The other barely covered a single mistake I'd prevented the company from making 6 months earlier. The call lasted 7 minutes. I know because I checked afterward, replaying it in my head the way you replay something that feels unreal but refuses to disappear. The HR manager smiled the entire time. Her voice practiced, gentle, careful not to sound apologetic. At one point, she said, "This isn't about comparison," which was impressive. Considering comparison was the only thing happening. I'm Amira Stone. I don't sell ideas in meetings or charm executives over coffee. I run operational risk. I'm the person who notices the flaw nobody wants to explain, the clause nobody reads twice, the process that quietly keeps the company from collapsing under regulatory pressure when systems don't fail. My name doesn't come up. That's usually the point. Ryan Cole is different. He speaks well. He presents clean slides. He knows how to make uncertainty sound like confidence. Leadership loves that. They love the way he looks like someone who has everything under control, especially when someone else is doing the controlling behind the scenes. As the HR manager kept talking, outlining how valued I was, a realization settled in. My bonus was smaller than the cost of a legal exposure I'd personally neutralized the previous quarter. A single decision I made quietly, without escalation, had saved more than 10 times what they'd just offered me to stay. That was the part that stung, not the money, the math. The company needed me more than they were willing to admit, and they were betting I wouldn't call that bluff. They were betting I'd mistake silence for loyalty and endurance for obligation. The call ended with a soft pause. Then, one final request. A retention agreement would be sent shortly. Nothing complicated, just a signature, required within 24 hours. They'd already decided my value. Now they wanted me to agree to it. I don't know how that moment landed with you, but if it stirred something heavy, you're not alone. Small things help more than we realize. Even adding a green plant near your window can quietly lift your mood day by day. Where are you listening from right now if this story speaks to you? I'd love for you to subscribe and stay with me, because the next part is where restraint turns into choice and nothing feels small anymore. I didn't start keeping records because I wanted revenge. That came later. At first, I was just tired of feeling like I was the only one who remembered how often I fixed things that were never supposed to break in the first place. There were moments I can still replay clearly. Ryan would rush into my office, voice low, eyes darting, asking if I had a minute. He never needed a minute. He needed an answer, a workaround, a quiet correction before his mistake reached someone with authority. I would pull up the numbers, adjust the assumptions, rewrite the risk language, then slide the file back to him without commentary. 5 minutes later, he'd walk out lighter, confident again, ready to explain the solution as if it had always been obvious. I told myself that was teamwork. I told myself visibility didn't matter as long as the outcome was right. That belief lasted longer than it should have. I wasn't invited to certain meetings because I wasn't needed. That was the phrase. Not excluded, not sidelined, just unnecessary. I'd find out later that decisions were made using models I had warned against, shortcuts I had already tested and rejected. When those shortcuts failed, my inbox would fill quietly, after hours, with requests for help phrased as favors. One message surfaced again and again in my memory once I started paying attention. It was an old email from my manager, forwarded without much thought at the time. One line stood out now, sharper than it had ever been. Let Ryan present. He looks confident, not knowledgeable, not prepared. Confident. That was when the bitterness settled in. Not loud, not explosive, just heavy. I finally understood the pattern I'd been part of. I wasn't invisible, I was convenient. I absorbed uncertainty so others could perform certainty in public. I carried the weight so someone else could look unburdened. What hurt most wasn't Ryan. He played the role he was rewarded for playing. What hurt was how easily my silence had been interpreted as consent. Once that thought took hold, I stopped dismissing small discomforts. I started noticing how often my name disappeared between drafts, how praise floated upward, while responsibility slid sideways. The realization didn't come with clarity, it came with exhaustion. So I began saving things: emails, meeting notes, version histories, system logs, not in a folder labeled evidence or leverage, just a quiet archive, built slowly, almost absent-mindedly. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't preparing a case. I just wanted to understand the shape of what I'd been living inside. Patterns reveal themselves when you stop looking away. Timelines connect. Decisions repeat. And once you see them clearly, you can't unsee them. By the time I finished organizing that archive, I wasn't angry anymore. I was calm in a way that felt unfamiliar. The kind of calm that comes right before you stop explaining yourself. I didn't call it protection or preparation. I told myself it was curiosity. Nothing more. But somewhere between timestamps and tracked changes, I felt the balance shift. Information stopped feeling heavy. It started to feel clarifying for the first time. I wasn't guessing where I stood. I was mapping it. And understanding, I learned, can be more unsettling than anger, because once you understand, staying still becomes a choice you can no longer pretend you didn't make. That was the moment silence stopped protecting me and started exposing exactly how replaceable they thought I was inside. The first alert came in quietly, the way serious problems usually do. No alarms, no panic language, just a line of data that didn't behave the way it was supposed to. I recognized it immediately. My stomach didn't drop. It tightened. This was the scenario I had flagged 3 months earlier, buried inside a risk memo that never made it past not urgent. Night shift has a different rhythm, fewer voices, fewer witnesses. When something breaks after midnight, there's no committee to hide behind. It's just you, the system, and the truth. I pulled up the dashboard and watched the indicators tilt in the wrong direction, one after another. Like dominoes moving slowly enough to pretend you still have time. I remembered the meeting where I'd warned them, the slide with the uncomfortable projection. Ryan had leaned back in his chair, smiling, and said we were overreacting. "We've got safeguards." He'd said, "Let's not spook people." The room had nodded along, grateful for reassurance. I'd gone quiet, like I always did when confidence won over caution. Now the safeguards were folding exactly the way I'd predicted. I started tracing the failure points, hands steady, thoughts clipped and precise. This wasn't panic work. This was confirmation. Each new data point lined up with the old warning, validating something I hadn't wanted to be right about. The tension wasn't loud. It was surgical, cold. My phone buzzed once, then again. A message from Ryan appeared on the screen, seeing some irregular activity. "You on this?" I didn't answer. Not yet. I wanted to see how far it would go without intervention. The system hesitated, then slipped again. 5 minutes later, another message arrived, shorter this time. "Please don't let this blow up." I stared at those words longer than I needed to. They weren't a request for help. They were a request for silence, for containment, for me to step in the way I always had, quietly absorbing the impact so the story stayed clean by morning. I pulled up my old risk memo and compared it line by line with what was happening now. Every assumption matched. Every mitigation I'd proposed was still missing. Nothing about this was surprising. That was the part that felt sharpest. The escalation protocol technically required me to loop in leadership. I could have done that. I could have drafted the message, framed the risk, managed the response, stayed awake until sunrise cleaning up decisions I hadn't made. I'd done it before, too many times. Instead, I opened my inbox and saw the retention email still sitting there, unread since earlier. The subject line promised appreciation, stability, alignment. I didn't open it yet. I already knew what it said. The system hiccuped again. This time, the ripple reached an external dependency. Not a full failure, just enough to leave a mark. Enough to trigger questions later. Ryan's typing indicator appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. I imagined him pacing somewhere brightly lit, rehearsing explanations, counting on me to make sure none of this ever reached daylight. That assumption had always been safe. I finally responded, choosing my words carefully. I'm monitoring. I wrote, which was true. I didn't add anything else. Minutes stretched. The issue stabilized, but only because demand shifted. Temporary luck, not resolution. I documented what I saw, noting timestamps, thresholds, near misses. My movements felt distant, as if I were watching myself from somewhere just above the situation. That was when I opened the retention email. Same polite tone, same emphasis on loyalty, same quiet request for commitment. I read it once, then closed it without replying. Another message from Ryan arrived. Any update I didn't answer. Not because I couldn't, because I wouldn't. The night moved on, heavy and unresolved, carrying consequences forward. And for the first time, I let it. I sat back, eyes on the screen, hands off the keyboard, understanding exactly what they'd been counting on and exactly why I was done proving them right. The choice felt final, irreversible, and strangely clean. Like drawing a line I would never erase. I didn't stand up because I was angry. Anger had already burned itself out, leaving something quieter behind. What made me rise from the chair was a sense of completion, like reaching the end of a task you'd been doing for years without realizing it had an ending. The office felt suspended in that late-night stillness, where nothing asks anything of you. Screens glowed softly, systems hummed. Everything looked stable in the shallow way appearances often are right before they aren't. I checked the clock once, not to mark the moment, but to confirm a decision I'd already made. 4 a.m. had arrived without ceremony, just like clarity sometimes does. I didn't leave immediately. I stayed for 11 more minutes, not out of hesitation, but out of habit. There were things that needed closing, the same way there always were. I exported the logs, carefully, methodically, the way I'd done 100 times before. Timestamps, error paths, notes written in neutral language. Nothing emotional, nothing accusatory, just facts preserved exactly as they were. Then I opened a new message, one email. No recipients beyond the required list. No explanation, no justification. I typed a single sentence, I am unavailable, effective immediately. I read it twice to make sure it said exactly what it meant, and nothing more. Then I sent it and closed my laptop. There was no rush of triumph, no fear either. Just an odd lightness, paired with a hollow space where urgency used to live. I slipped my badge into my bag, not as a symbolic gesture, but because leaving it behind would have created another task for someone else to manage. I'd always been considerate that way. As I walked through the quiet corridor, I noticed details I'd ignored for years. The scuff on the wall near the exit, the hum of ventilation that never quite faded. None of it felt sentimental. It felt distant, like a place I'd already outgrown before physically leaving it. Outside. The air was cool and empty. The city hadn't decided what kind of day it was going to be yet. I stood there for a moment, not thinking about what came next, just existing without obligation, without a queue of invisible expectations lining up behind my thoughts. When I got home, I didn't check my phone. I didn't open my email again. I made coffee out of routine, then let it sit untouched while I stared at nothing in particular. The emptiness wasn't frightening. It was spacious, for the first time in years. There was no immediate problem demanding proof of my usefulness. Later, when I finally did look at my inbox, the messages were already stacking. Short questions, vague concern, one overly polite note from HR that used the word availability too many times. I read none of them fully. They blurred together into the same noise I'd been filtering for years, before shutting everything down for good. I logged in one last time, not to fix anything, to activate the contingency process I'd helped design years earlier. The replacement protocol, on paper, it was solid, a rotating escalation ladder, cross-trained coverage, distributed responsibility. In reality, it depended on someone like me quietly filling the gaps. I followed the steps exactly as written. No shortcuts, no warnings, just compliance. Once it was live, I logged out. The system would hold for a while, long enough for everyone to believe they were fine, long enough for the illusion to stay intact until it didn't. I knew where the stress points were. I knew which assumptions would fail first, and I knew that when they did. There would be no quick fix, no familiar name to route the problem to. That knowledge didn't feel vindictive. It felt factual. I lay down as the sky began to lighten. Not tired, not relieved, just strangely empty. The kind of emptiness that comes after you stop carrying something heavy and realize you don't quite know what to do with your hands yet. I closed my eyes without setting an alarm. Whatever happened next would happen without me holding it together. And for the first time, that felt less like abandonment and more like balance being restored. Exactly the way it should have been all along. Silence doesn't arrive all at once. It builds in layers, slipping between sounds until you realize it's louder than anything that came before it. That was how the hours after I left began quiet on my end. Frantic everywhere else. I didn't need to check Slack to know what was happening. My phone vibrated anyway. Relentless. Lighting up the table with notifications I refused to open. Channels I hadn't spoken in for months suddenly remembered my name. General, Ops Risk, Incident Response. Each ping carried the same question in different disguises. Are you seeing this? Do you have context? Can someone loop Amira in? I let the phone face down. Waiting is harder than acting. Action gives you something to hide behind. Silence strips that away. I sat with my coffee going cold, listening to nothing but the hum of the refrigerator, and wondered how long it would take before concern turned into fear. It didn't take long. An email came through from HR mid-morning, carefully worded and carefully useless. The subject line read, "Checking in." The message asked about my well-being, my availability, whether everything was okay. It didn't ask why I'd left. It didn't mention the incident. It was the corporate equivalent of knocking lightly and hoping no one answered so they could say they tried. I didn't reply. A few minutes later, Ryan texted, not through Slack, directly. That alone told me how uncomfortable he was. "Hey Amira," he wrote. Casual, friendly, like we were equals catching up. "Hope you're doing all right. Things are a little hectic here. When you get a chance. Would love to sync." I stared at the message longer than I should have. The tone was wrong. Too soft. Too rehearsed. He wasn't asking for help. He was asking for rescue, wrapped in politeness. I imagined him smiling as he typed it, confident I'd step back in the way I always had. I didn't respond. By the afternoon, the messages grew shorter, less careful. Someone tagged me openly in a thread, then deleted it. Another asked if I was still monitoring remotely. The assumption lingered, stubborn and unexamined, that I was still there in some form, invisible but available. That was the strangest part. They hadn't noticed my absence yet. They'd noticed the gap, the delay, the friction, but not the cause. Not me. I finally opened Slack, not to engage, but to observe. Threads scrolled past, dense with jargon and urgency. People pasted fragments of documentation into chat, arguing over interpretations, screenshots of dashboards circled with digital markers. It all looked familiar, like watching someone else try to wear your coat and wonder why it didn't fit. That was when I recognized the language. A block of text repeated across multiple messages caught my eye. The phrasing was precise. Too precise. I knew it because I'd written it. A procedure outline, lifted from an internal guide I'd drafted years earlier. I watched them quote it line by line, debating what it meant, missing the point entirely. They were using my work. They just didn't understand it. One comment stood out. "I think this means we escalate after step 4, someone wrote. Another replied, "No, step 4 assumes prior validation." They went back and forth, confident, wrong in opposite directions. The document had never been meant to stand alone. It was designed for someone who already understood the system, not someone encountering it for the first time under pressure. I felt a tightness in my chest. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something closer to clarity. Ryan posted again, thanking everyone for stepping up. He avoided specifics. He always did when he wasn't sure. Reading it felt like watching a performance where the script was missing its most important pages. I closed Slack and leaned back, letting the silence settle again. The waiting wasn't passive anymore. It was revealing. Each unanswered message stretched the space between who they thought held things together and who actually did. I hadn't broken anything. I hadn't taken anything with me. All I'd done was stop translating complexity into comfort. And now they were surrounded by my words, my frameworks, my logic, using them like tools without knowing which end to hold. That realization landed quietly but firmly. They didn't just underestimate my value. They mistook documentation for understanding. And once that confusion takes hold, no amount of friendly messages can fix it. I stayed silent, not out of spite, but because the silence itself was finally doing the explaining for me. The first name I saw wasn't Ryan's. That's what made my stomach turn. It appeared in a forwarded message, buried halfway down a chain that had already lost its original subject line. A junior analyst, someone quiet, someone new enough to still believe mistakes were personal failures instead of structural ones. The message said they had missed a step and that the lapse had contributed to the incident. The language was careful, passive, almost kind. But the implication was clear responsibility had found a softer place to land. That was when the waiting stopped feeling neutral. I'd expected confusion, scrambling, even a little panic. What I hadn't expected was displacement, watching accountability slide downward, away from the people who shaped the system and onto the person least equipped to defend themselves, stirred something sharp and unwelcome in me. For the first time since I'd walked away, guilt surfaced. I knew how this worked. I'd seen it before. When processes fail, leadership looks for a person-shaped explanation, preferably someone without history, without leverage, without the vocabulary to push back. It was cleaner that way, less threatening. The analyst's name stayed with me all afternoon. I imagined them sitting stiffly in a meeting, nodding too quickly, apologizing for things they hadn't designed. I imagined Ryan across the table, concerned, disappointed, relieved. That image unsettled me more than the messages ever had. I told myself it wasn't my fault. I hadn't assigned blame, I hadn't written the narrative, but the truth pressed in anyway if I'd stayed. This wouldn't be happening, not because I would have fixed the problem, but because I would have absorbed the consequences, like I always had. That thought followed me into the evening. I paced my apartment, replaying the past few days, weighing restraint against responsibility. I could go back, just once. I could clarify the failure points, redirect the conversation, protect someone who didn't deserve to be collateral. It would take a single call, a single explanation, a brief re-entry into a role I technically no longer held. The temptation surprised me. It felt familiar. Like muscle memory. Step in, smooth it over, leave quietly again. No one would know. That was the danger. I sat down and opened my laptop, hands hovering over the keyboard, for a moment. I drafted the message in my head. Neutral tone, clear logic, enough distance to seem professional, enough insight to be effective. I'd done this kind of thing dozens of times. Then I stopped, because I knew exactly where that road led. One explanation would turn into two, clarification into involvement, responsibility into expectation. The system wouldn't change. It would adjust just enough to keep using me without acknowledging me. I closed the draft before typing a word. The guilt didn't disappear. But it shifted. It became something heavier, more grounded, a recognition that shielding people from broken systems often keeps those systems intact. And intact systems keep producing the same outcomes. I needed another option, one that didn't require my return. That was when I thought about the audit process, not the theatrical kind leadership feared, but the quiet, procedural one that followed patterns and documentation, the kind that didn't respond to